So joining us now, Katie Barlow, host of Words Matter and media editor over at SCOTUSblog. Definitely one of my favorite blogs on the planet. Katie, always a pleasure to have you here. So give us a little bit of a sense about what this case is all about.
Thanks for having me and for reading. This case, as you said at the very beginning, is a major Second Amendment rights case. The court will determine, as they did in 2008 and 2010, they issued a landmark ruling saying that Americans have an individual right to possess a firearm for the purpose of self-protection within the home. And this case will potentially determine whether that right extends beyond the home and out into the public sphere and the individual right to possess a firearm out in public. So it's a huge case that they have agreed to take on. They decided not to take on Second Amendment cases late last term. They were looking at considering over 10 Second Amendment cases last term and decided not to take them up. So it is noteworthy that they have now decided to take it up for early next term.
Katie, obviously this is a New York-centric case, but obviously it has bigger ramifications outside of just New York. Could this case potentially lead to an expansion here, potentially, of the Second Amendment, just based on how the justices define this case?
Yes, New York is not alone in its law. The law in New York essentially says that in order to get a concealed carry permit, you have to show a special reason why you have a need for self-defense outside of the general public's need for it. And that's what the two individuals in this case who sued the state of New York are challenging. And New York is not the only state that has that kind of law that requires that special showing or a next level showing in order to get a concealed carry permit. So if the court were to strike down New York's law, that would affect all of those states' laws at that point, or even states that are considering those types of gun restrictions in the wake of the shootings that we have seen recently and over the last few years since the court last dealt with this issue. So yes, it is a New York case, but it certainly has ramifications that will be felt across the country.
Given the fact that we have an uptick in gun violence and there's a gun massacre, it seems like almost every week in this country, and given the fact that Congress cannot get any sort of legislation passed when it comes to gun reform here, does that add added pressure then on the justices regarding this particular case based on what's happening right now in this country with gun violence?
I think if you ask the justices, they may all have different answers, but many of them would say their job is to look at the law. And in particular, the more recent appointees, including Justices Kavanaugh and Justice Barrett, who replaced Justice Anthony Kennedy and Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, both take a history-first approach, have suggested in their writings and in their opinions, they take a history-first approach to the Second Amendment, looking at what that meant at the founding and gun rights at the founding and how the Second Amendment was implemented and thought about during the founding era. So they won't necessarily be looking at headlines today and what's happening today. Their interpretation of the law, which is what they see their job is, will be looking, as we have seen from their writings, at the founding era and how that was the approach that was taken at that time for firearms and the individual right to possess those firearms.
Yeah, let's dive into the justices a little bit more, because I'm glad you brought up Kavanaugh here, because essentially now in a 6-3 conservative Supreme Court, Brett Kavanaugh, which I can't believe I say this, is the swing justice in all of this now, based on all of that. Based on precedents here, based on how he's ruled in the past, is he basically going to be the swing justice in this particular case, potentially, given the fact that the more conservative members of the court, the Clarence Thomases and the Samuel Alitos, likely are not going to rule in New York's favor here?
Yes, Justice Thomas and Justice Alito have suggested they are ready to take up a Second Amendment case. They are interested in further defining and think that maybe the lower courts are not fully following their precedent, as you mentioned, in 2008 and 2010 in a case called DC v. Heller. And we know actually that Justice Kavanaugh also wrote last year when he was on the court that it may be time to take up a Second Amendment case because he thinks that perhaps the lower courts are not correctly interpreting their previous cases on the individual right to possess. We also know from his time on the DC circuit that he would likely take a more expansive and robust view of the individual right to possess a firearm. We equally have some information from Justice Barrett's short time on the bench in the Seventh Circuit. She only had one opinion related to guns, and it was a dissent in that case. But she, again, took a history-first approach and a more expansive view of the individual right to possess under the Second Amendment. So those two individuals replacing Justices Kennedy and Ginsburg, who did not take as expansive a view of the Second Amendment, is remarkable, and perhaps the reason why the court decided to take this issue up at this time rather than even late last term.
Katie, on a different note regarding the Supreme Court, obviously there is a lot of Democratic pressure right now on Justice Stephen Breyer to retire potentially at the end of his term, given the fact that Stephen Breyer is now the oldest member of the court in his 80s. Do you know anything more about potentially what Stephen Breyer's plans are here, and do you expect potentially Stephen Breyer to retire maybe in June when the term is over?
Oh, that's the topic we're all discussing at the moment. I certainly don't have any inside information on the justices' thinking, but we're looking at the pieces of information that we have. We know that he's hired 4 law clerks for next term. And so if he were to retire, those 4 law clerks would not be working for him and would have to get distributed to the other justices. Not a big deal, but some indication that he may be planning on staying. But on the other hand, we know that he was very good friends with Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. He saw how that played out in public and politically after her death. That was unexpected. And I think he might take that to heart as well in his consideration of when and whether to step down. But look, also, he is just now leading the more liberal wing of the Supreme Court after his many, many years on the bench. So this is something that he hasn't had an opportunity to dive into and experience just yet. So he may be thinking to hang on for one more year and see what work he can do in the coming year. So it's really anyone's guess. You can look at the evidence either way at this point, and there's no way to tell what's in the justice's mind, and we'll know when he decides to tell us.
Yeah, very good point. Katie Barlow, host of Words Matter and media editor over at SCOTUSblog. Always a pleasure, Katie. Thanks so much for joining us this morning.